I really like the title of your book, but it's also a little disconcerting, I'd have to say. The fact that why nobody wants to go to church anymore, I think that's been a problem that has been in the back of our mind, maybe a part of a lot of discussions. But I want to ask you first, before we find out what you found out, what was your concern that caused you to write this book? Did you notice this trend in your own church, perhaps?
Not only in my own church, but we've been working professionally resourcing churches over the past 40 years. And we've noticed a number of things over those decades that have led us to some real concern. There's something happening right now that's different than what's happened in the past 100 years in the church in America.
Okay, I think of the 70s and the 80s and kind of the youth movement bringing up all sorts of praise and worship type churches. So we have seen kind of growth that way, but we are seeing some problems. Tell us what you have found in your research about people who are leaving the church.
There are some startling things happening today. In fact, 80% of churches today are either stuck or in decline. And we're losing people across the board, all demographics, all denominations. And it's especially striking in the younger generations. The millennial generation is leaving us in record numbers.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't Christians. They're just not going to church necessarily every week?
Correct. Although there is some softening in terms of people identifying themselves as Christian or with any religion, what's sometimes called the nones, the N-O-N-E-S, people who choose no religious affiliation. That group in America is growing, and rather quickly.
All right, so what were some of the questions that you posed to, I suppose, people who were going to church, who weren't going to church, and maybe people in between, if you can be that way?
Well, we found 4 different recurring themes that came up with people across the country, both in our own research and in other people's research. We conducted interviews with people across the country, and 4 things came up as to why they were staying away from church. First one is they say, I feel judged, that church people and the church in general judges me, myself, my background, my past, my lifestyle, and that's one of the things that's keeping them away. The second thing that we heard over and over, and this one surprised us a bit because we hadn't heard this before. This one was that at church, you're just lecturing me. It's a one-way communication setup where you're not interested in what I think. You're not interested in my thoughts or my questions. And they are interested no more in that kind of approach. People today are coming from an interactive society, probably driven by the internet, where they want to be involved in the process. They want to go back and forth. They want their questions addressed. So church as we know it simply is not set up for that in their point of view. The third thing that we heard is that, well, this one's probably familiar to us, that church and church people are simply a bunch of hypocrites. But what's new about that is they're not simply saying that, well, you say one thing and do another. What they're reflecting upon is that you're setting yourself up as a know-it-all, as the person with all the answers, and we know it's not that simple. They want to be engaged with people who are seeing that they are part of the journey, part of a spiritual journey, and that we're all in this together is what they're looking for. And finally, the fourth thing that we heard from people is that, you know what, your God seems irrelevant, or at least when I have attached myself to a church experience, a worship service or whatever, I don't really sense the presence of God there. I can find God elsewhere in greater degree than I do in what you do at church.
Well, some of the things that you've mentioned there, if you just take the structure of how church is kind of designed, the meetings, doesn't matter what theological perspective you come from, the format is largely, I think, the same. You normally have a preacher who is preaching out there. Do you think this could really change a lot in that style structure to be able to be relevant to millennials, for example?
Yeah, that's what we're asking people to do, is to reevaluate the methods that we're using in the church. We're not asking to reevaluate the message. The message is the same and will always be the same. But the methods that people, human beings, have created over the past hundreds of years are called into question now. So, for instance, we're looking at coming back upon those 4 things that people say are driving them away from church, and we're suggesting 4 things that we can do differently that will connect better with today's culture.
So have you come up with those 4 proposals?
Yeah. When people say, I feel judged, we say, let's create an environment of radical hospitality. And by that, we mean that we're ready to accept, just as Jesus did, we're ready to accept the person just as they are without judging them. Now, that doesn't mean that we're endorsing everything that they do or all of their values. We believe that we can accept without necessarily endorse, and that's what people are looking for. We call that radical hospitality. And when they say, well, I don't want to be lectured, it's a one-way communication structure, we say, let's engage in fearless conversation, where it's a two-way street. Even Sunday morning in worship, where we allow for people to engage with one another, spend a few minutes talking with one another about the subject at hand, and allow questions. Now, I know sometimes that makes pastors and preachers freak out because they say, well, what happens if somebody asks me a question I don't know the answer to? Well, that's where the fearless part of the conversation comes in, where we're not afraid to tackle any question or any subject that people come up with. And it's okay to say, you know what? I don't know the answer to that question, but together we're going to find some ways through this. The third thing that people say is that the church is just a bunch of hypocrites. But we say the antidote to that is genuine humility, where we have an authenticity that we project with people, where they get the idea that, you know what, we're all in this together. No one of us is closer to God, or no one of us has all the answers. We're all in this together, and we're going to work through it together. When they sense that, that's attractive to people. And then finally, when people say your God is irrelevant or I'm not finding God there, we advocate that we use something that we call divine anticipation, that we're looking for God to show up, and we create our experiences around that. We give space for God to show up. You know, I think sometimes in the church, we've become so accustomed to putting out what we're putting out that we're ready to move on to more advanced theological stuff. And where the culture is today is they're way back at first base, where they just want to know that God is real. And the more that we can bring up the stories, even from among the people, from among their peers, where they can hear stories of God active today, not just yesterday, not just 2,000 years ago when the scriptures were written, but today, where they can see that God is actually alive, active, and among us today. That's attractive to people.
You know, I think most of the items that you mentioned there, I think a lot of churches would strive to have. They may not have it, but that idea of saying, hey, we're not perfect. In fact, we're kind of the spiritual hospital, so that's why we're here. As well as a pastor, if he projects himself or herself as infallible, then that's going to be a problem right there, too. It almost, I think, when you were talking about this, I was thinking back, remember talk shows when you'd watch on TV, they'd be a one-way conversation until Phil Donahue started running up and down the aisles with microphones asking questions. Now, I only want to bring the analogy to that and a church service the same, but I think what you're talking about is having this ability to be able to have an ongoing conversation, which I almost think the first generation Christians after Christ left and left the apostles in charge, that's probably the kind of environment they had, because I'm sure they had a lot of questions, met in smaller groups, and I'm sure there was a dialogue going back and forth. So in a way, do you see this almost as reinventing ourselves back to what may have been the very first type of church services?
Yeah, in many ways, exactly that. We're looking back to how the church began, and we can find some real secrets there, I think, that we need to return to. Because what we're finding ourselves with today, I think, is not too dissimilar from what Jesus found when he came and began his ministry here, and he found that the church, as we know it back then, the temple, was distracted by all sorts of other things that weren't directed at helping people develop a close and growing relationship with God. They were all bound up in rules and traditions that Jesus was highly critical of. He came in part to help shake that up and help people realize that it's time to return to what we're really about, I think we're in the same place today.
All right. We only have a few minutes left. I want to ask, have you come across opposition to some of these ideas that you say how we could reinvent ourselves? Are some people saying, this isn't what I really feel comfortable doing? Maybe some pastors who've had that thought?
Sure have. When dealing with the church in particular, we're dealing with a behemoth of a machine that is cloaked and bound by tradition. We've been doing the same thing for so long that our methodology in many people's minds has become holy itself. And when you challenge that, it makes people very uncomfortable. And when we talk about the reasons that people say they're staying away from church, one of the knee-jerk reactions that some church leaders have is wanting to attack the unchurched, saying, well, those reasons are bogus. They're just excuses. And they want to spend their time attacking people for coming up with those reasons on why they're staying away. And that's a waste of time from our point of view. To attack the customer, as it were, will never help us solve the problem and help make the gospel more approachable for people. Not changing the message, but changing the method on how we do that.
I'm thinking you may be opening up a whole nother classroom activity for would-be pastors on how to perform your church service out of the box, so to speak, because of all of this. I appreciate you being with us. Thom Schultz, author of Why Nobody Wants to Go to Church Anymore. I appreciate you kind of tackling this, and I think a lot of people are going to be fascinated by what you've come up with. Thank you.
Thank you.